Flight vanished midair in 1981. It landed this morning with newspapers from that very day. The coffee in Sarah Mitchell's cup had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the radar screen. As the night shift supervisor at Cedar Valley Regional Airport, she'd seen her share of strange blips and unexplained signals, but this one made her stomach twist into knots. "Tower, this is unidentified aircraft approaching from the northeast. Please respond." She spoke into her headset, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Static crackled back at her. The dot on her screen moved with the steady, deliberate pace of a commercial aircraft, but there was no flight plan, no radio contact, and most disturbing of all, no transponder code. In 2025, that was virtually impossible. Every aircraft in the sky had digital fingerprints, satellite tracking, and mandatory communication protocols. "Sarah, you need to see this," called out Marcus, the junior controller, his voice tight with disbelief. He was standing at the observation window, binoculars pressed to his eyes. She joined him, and her breath caught in her throat. Emerging from the pre-dawn darkness was a Boeing 727, its distinctive three-engine configuration unmistakable even in the dim light. But something was wrong. The livery was faded, the paint scheme decades out of date, and the registration numbers were barely visible through what looked like years of weathering. "That's a museum piece," Marcus whispered. "They don't even make parts for those anymore." The aircraft approached with eerie precision, its landing lights cutting through the morning mist. No radio chatter, no distress signals, just the steady drone of engines that should have been retired before Marcus was even born. Sarah's hands moved automatically across her controls, clearing the runway and alerting emergency services, but her mind raced with impossible questions. The plane touched down with the grace of an experienced pilot, its tires kissing the asphalt with barely a whisper. As it rolled to a stop near the terminal, Sarah could make out the faded letters along the fuselage, Northeastern Airways, in a font that belonged to a different era. Within minutes, the runway swarmed with activity. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their red and blue lights painting the dawn sky in urgent colors. Sarah watched through the window as mechanics wheeled stairs up to the plane's door, their faces masks of professional concern mixed with barely concealed curiosity. The first passengers began to emerge, and Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor. They looked exactly as they would have in 1981. A woman in a powder blue dress with shoulder pads that screamed early 80s stepped carefully down the stairs, her hair in a perfect feathered style that had been fashionable when Sarah was just a child. Behind her came a man in a brown suit, his tie wide and his shoes the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades. One by one, they emerged, men and women who looked like they'd stepped out of a time capsule, their faces confused and frightened, but unmistakably young. "This is impossible," Marcus breathed beside her. "That flight. I remember reading about it in aviation school. Flight 281. It disappeared in 1981 during a routine trip from Boston to Miami. They never found so much as a piece of wreckage." Sarah's mind reeled. She'd heard the stories, the aviation mysteries that instructors used to captivate students. Flight 281 had been one of the most puzzling disappearances in commercial aviation history. 137 passengers and crew had simply vanished over the Atlantic Ocean on a clear June morning, leaving behind only scattered radio transmissions and a decades-long search that yielded nothing. And now they were here, walking across her runway as if no time had passed at all. The passengers huddled together near the aircraft, their voices carrying across the tarmac in a confused babble. Sarah could see them gesturing frantically, some pointing at the modern emergency vehicles, others staring in bewilderment at the airport's updated terminal building. A few held newspapers in their hands, newspapers with headlines about Reagan's economic policies and the latest IBM computer technology. "Ma'am," a voice crackled through her radio. It was Captain Rodriguez from the fire department. "We've got a situation down here. These people, they're saying it's June 7th, 1981. They think they've been in the air for 6 hours. Sarah's hands shook as she keyed the microphone. "Copy that, Captain," Any injuries? Negative on injuries, but they're all in shock. They're asking about gas prices and whether the Soviets are still in Afghanistan. Ma'am, there's something else. The radio fell silent for a moment, and Sarah could hear Rodriguez's heavy breathing. Go ahead, Captain. There's a man down here, older than the others. Says he's the pilot. He's not talking to anyone, just keeps saying the same thing over and over. What's he saying? They let us go. Just that, nothing else. They let us go. Sarah watched as the last figure emerged from the aircraft, a man in a captain's uniform that, unlike the passengers, seemed to bear the weight of years. His hair was grayer than it should have been, his shoulders stooped with an invisible burden. Even from the tower, she could see the tremor in his hands as he gripped the stair railing. Captain Frank Mallory. The name came back to her from those old case studies. He'd been 41 when Flight 281 disappeared, a veteran pilot with an impeccable record and a reputation for steady nerves. Now he looked like a man who'd lived through decades of torment, his eyes hollow and distant as he surveyed the modern world that had grown up around his absence. The passengers were being led toward the terminal, their voices growing louder as they passed beneath the tower windows. Sarah caught fragments of their conversations, questions about their families, confusion about the date, desperate pleas for someone to explain what was happening. But Captain Mallory walked alone, separated from his passengers by an invisible barrier of knowledge they didn't share. Sarah, Marcus said quietly, look at the plane. She turned her attention back to the Boeing 727, and her blood ran cold. The aircraft was aging before her eyes. The paint that had seemed merely faded moments before was now peeling and cracking. The metal showed signs of corrosion that should have taken decades to develop. One of the engines was making a grinding sound that spoke of mechanical failure, and she could see fuel leaking from the wing tanks onto the tarmac. It's like it's catching up, Marcus whispered. Like 44 years of wear and tear are happening all at once. Emergency crews were backing away from the aircraft now, their instruments detecting structural failures that were multiplying by the minute. Within hours, Sarah realized, the plane would be nothing more than a pile of corroded metal and rotting fabric, evidence of a journey that should have been impossible. Down on the tarmac, Captain Mallory had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, his back to the dying aircraft, his face turned toward the rising sun. Even from this distance, Sarah could see his lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a confession. They let us go, Rodriguez had said. He kept repeating. But who were they? And if they had let Flight 281 go, what had they wanted in return? As the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah Mitchell realized she was witnessing something that would change everything she thought she knew about the world. The passengers of Flight 281 had returned, but they'd brought with them questions that might never be answered and a mystery that ran deeper than anyone could imagine. And somewhere in the growing crowd of investigators and officials, Captain Frank Mallory stood alone with his secrets, carrying the weight of 44 years and the terrible knowledge of what it had cost to bring his passengers home. The medical tent buzzed with activity as doctors examined the passengers of Flight 281, their instruments confirming what everyone already knew but couldn't accept. These people had not aged a single day in 44 years. Blood pressure normal, reflexes sharp, cellular structure consistent with their reported ages from 1981. It was as if time had simply stopped for them. But Captain Frank Mallory refused to be examined. He sat alone on a folding chair outside the tent, his pilot's cap resting on his knees, staring at something in his palm. Dr. Elizabeth Chin, the lead physician, had approached him 3 times, each attempt met with a polite but firm shake of his head. The man who had emerged from that impossible aircraft seemed to carry decades of exhaustion in his shoulders, despite looking barely older than he should have in 1981. Captain Mallory? Dr. Chin tried once more. We really need to run some tests. After what you've been through. I remember, Frank said quietly, his voice hoarse with an emotion she couldn't identify. That's the difference between me and them. I remember all of it. He opened his palm, revealing a small black and white photograph, creased and worn as if it had been handled countless times. The image showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a man in a pilot's uniform, a younger version of Frank himself. "My wife, Helen," he said, his thumb tracing the edge of the photo. "She would have been 72 last month. I missed her birthday. I missed all of them." Dr. Chen knelt beside his chair, her medical training warring with her human curiosity. "Captain, where have you been? The passengers think they've only been gone 6 hours, but you're talking like I lived through every day of the past 44 years? Frank looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her step back. Pain, yes, but also guilt so deep it seemed to have carved lines into his soul. "Because I did. Every single day, watching the world change beneath us, watching my passengers sleep while I counted the cost of my choices." Behind them, the passengers were being reunited with families who had aged decades in their absence. Gray-haired children embraced mothers who looked younger than they did now. Grandchildren met grandparents who appeared to be their peers. The scene was heartbreaking and miraculous in equal measure. Frank closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in 1981, sitting in Murphy's Bar near Boston Logan Airport. The place had been nearly empty that evening, just him and the bartender, and the crushing weight of what he'd done. The poker game had been supposed to be friendly, just pilots blowing off steam between flights. He'd never been good at knowing when to quit. $57,000. That's what he owed Vincent Marconi, a man whose patience had already worn thin. Frank had mortgaged the house, sold Helen's engagement ring when she wasn't looking, even borrowed against his pilot's pension. Nothing had been enough to fill the hole his addiction had carved in their lives. "You look like a man who's run out of time," a voice had said beside him. Frank opened his eyes in the present, but the memory continued to play like a film reel in his mind. The stranger had been wearing a white suit, perfectly pressed despite the bar's smoky atmosphere. His hair was silver, his smile too wide, and his eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. "I'm sorry," Frank had said, not really in the mood for conversation. "Time," the stranger had repeated, sliding onto the adjacent bar stool. "It's the one thing we never have enough of, isn't it? Always running out just when we need it most." Frank had noticed the man's hands then, smooth and pale, with fingers that seemed to move independently of any conscious thought. When he'd lifted his drink, the ice hadn't clinked against the glass. "I'm Vincent Thorne," the stranger had said, extending one of those unsettling hands. "And I'm here to offer you something most people would finish for." "And what's that?" Frank had asked, his desperation making him willing to listen to anyone. "Time," Vincent had smiled. "All the time you need to fix your mistakes. To stop the clock before it runs out completely." Frank had laughed bitterly. "Right. And what would that cost me?" "Oh, not much," Vincent had said, his smile never wavering. "Just the years you'd have anyway. The difference is, you'll experience them all at once, compressed into a single moment of understanding. Your passengers will sleep peacefully through it all. They'll wake up tomorrow as if nothing happened. And the catch? The catch, my dear captain, is that you'll remember every second. Every day they sleep, you'll live. Every birthday they miss, you'll feel. Every funeral, every celebration, every moment of joy and sorrow, you'll experience it all while they dream." Frank had stared at the stranger, wondering if this was what a breakdown felt like. "You're insane." "Am I?" Vincent had pulled out a business card, plain white with no text, just a symbol that seemed to shift and change when Frank wasn't looking directly at it. "Tomorrow you have a flight to Miami. Such a routine trip. But I know about your debts, Captain Mallory. I know about the men who are coming for you, and what they'll do to Helen when they can't find you." Frank's blood had turned to ice. "How do you accept my offer?" Vincent had continued. "And you'll buy yourself enough time to set things right. Refuse, and well, let's just say some debts can't be paid in money alone." Back in the present, Frank felt the weight of his wedding ring, a ring he'd somehow never lost, even though Helen had divorced him in 1983, unable to cope with his disappearance. He'd watched it all from wherever they'd been, suspended between moments, seeing the world age while his passengers remained frozen in time. "Captain?" Dr. Chen's voice brought him back to the present. You said you remember? Remember what? Frank looked at her, this woman who couldn't understand what he'd sacrificed, what he'd agreed to in a moment of desperation. I remember the price of buying time, he said softly. And I remember that some debts can never truly be paid. He stood up, pocketing the photograph and his wedding ring. Around him, the passengers were being loaded into buses, ready to begin the impossible task of rebuilding lives that had been interrupted by decades they never experienced. But Frank Mallory knew the truth. Their ordeal was over. His was just beginning. Emma Rodriguez had been 7 years old when her father's plane disappeared. She remembered the phone call that changed everything, her mother's face crumpling as she listened to the voice on the other end, the words, missing, and presumed lost, echoing through their small kitchen. Co-pilot James Rodriguez had been Frank Mallory's closest friend, his flying partner for over 6 years. Now, at 51, Emma stood in the airport's family waiting area, her hands trembling as she watched the impossible unfold. Frank recognized her immediately, even though she'd grown from a gap-toothed child into a woman with silver streaks in her dark hair. When their eyes met across the crowded room, something passed between them, a shared understanding of loss that transcended the supernatural circumstances surrounding them. Emma, Frank said softly as she approached, his voice carrying the weight of decades. You look just like your mother did at your age. Captain Mallory, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I need to know what happened to my father. I need to understand. Frank glanced around the busy terminal, noting the investigators and reporters who were already circling like vultures. Not here. Too many years, too many questions I can't answer in front of them. 20 minutes later, they sat in Emma's car in the airport parking lot, the morning sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. Frank had insisted on leaving the terminal, claiming he needed air, but Emma suspected he was avoiding the medical teams and federal investigators who were demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. Your father was a good man, Frank began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Better than I deserved as a partner. He tried to talk me out of that last poker game, you know. Said I was in too deep, that I should tell Helen the truth about our debts. Emma had heard fragments of the story over the years, whispered conversations between her aunts, court records from the investigation into the disappearance. But she'd never known about the gambling, never understood the desperation that had driven Frank to that bar on the night before their final flight. What happened up there? She asked. The passengers think they've been gone 6 hours, but you're different. You remember something they don't. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the windshield. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. We were 37 minutes out of Boston when it happened. Beautiful clear morning, perfect flying weather. Your father was running through the pre-landing checklist for Miami when the instruments started going crazy. He closed his eyes, and Emma could see the memories playing across his face like shadows. The compass spun like a top, the radio filled with static that sounded almost like voices. Then the sky around us just changed. The blue became something else, something deeper. Stars appeared in broad daylight, but they weren't moving. They were frozen, like someone had stopped time itself. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. And then Vincent Thorne appeared in the cockpit. Frank's voice cracked slightly. Just materialized out of thin air, still wearing that white suit, still smiling that terrible smile. He looked at your father and said, "Don't worry, James. You'll sleep through this part." My father, did he know what was happening? He tried to fight it at first, tried to grab the controls. But Vincent just touched his forehead, and James fell into the deepest sleep I've ever seen. One by one, the passengers followed. Their eyes just closed. Even the flight attendants mid-sentence, as if someone had turned off a switch. Frank opened his eyes, and Emma saw tears streaming down his cheeks. But not me. I was awake for all of it. The plane kept flying, but we weren't in our world anymore. We were somewhere else, somewhere between moments. I could see Earth below us, but it was like watching a movie at fast-forward speed. Seasons changed in minutes, cities grew and shrank, people lived entire lives in the blink of an eye. For 44 years? Every single day. I watched your father sleep while I saw you grow up. I saw your high school graduation, your wedding, the birth of your children. I saw your mother remarry, saw her grow old, saw her funeral 3 years ago. His voice broke completely. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry you had to bury an empty casket. Emma reached across the car and took his hand. It was trembling, and she could feel the weight of decades in his grip. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known. But I did know, Frank interrupted. Vincent told me exactly what would happen. He said I'd experience every moment they slept through, that I'd feel the weight of every passing year. He said it was the price of buying time, of saving them from the consequences of my choices. What consequences? Frank pulled his hand away and reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a yellowed piece of paper. It was a promissory note, signed in his handwriting, with Vincent Marconi's name at the bottom. But there was something else, a second signature in ink that seemed to shimmer and move. Vincent Thorne wasn't just some stranger in a bar, Frank said. He was something else, something that feeds on time itself. He offered me a deal. My passengers would be safe, frozen in the moment, while I experienced every year of their lost lives. At the end of 44 years, he'd release them, and they could go home. And you? Frank smiled sadly. I was never supposed to go home, Emma. I was supposed to stay with him, to pay the debt with my existence. But something went wrong. When the plane landed this morning, I was still here. Still breathing, still remembering. Emma felt her heart racing. What does that mean? It means the deal isn't finished, Frank said, his voice filled with a terrible certainty. Vincent Thorne let us go, but he didn't release me. I'm still bound to him, still carrying the weight of those 44 years. And sooner or later, he's going to come to collect what he's owed. Outside the car, the sun climbed higher in the sky, but Emma felt surrounded by darkness. The father she'd mourned for decades was still lost, still sleeping in a place between worlds, while the man who'd been meant to protect him carried the burden of impossible memories. There has to be a way to break the deal, she said. Some way to free you from this. Frank looked at her with eyes that held the weight of ages. Maybe, he said quietly. But first, I need to understand why Vincent let us go. After 44 years of keeping his bargain, why would he suddenly change the rules? As if in response to his words, the radio in Emma's car crackled to life, filling the air with static that sounded almost like whispers. For just a moment, both of them could have sworn they heard laughter, soft, knowing, and utterly without warmth. The game, it seemed, was far from over. 3 days after the impossible landing, Frank Mallory stood in his hotel bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, he was 35 again, getting ready for another routine flight. Then he blinked, and suddenly he was 79, his face lined with decades of sorrow. Another blink, and he was 17, full of dreams about touching the sky. The time slips were getting worse. It had started small, brief flashes where he'd see himself at different ages, memories from lives he'd never lived bleeding into his consciousness. But now the episodes were lasting longer, becoming more vivid, more disorienting. He gripped the sink's edge, his knuckles white with strain, as another wave of temporal displacement washed over him. Suddenly, he was in his childhood bedroom, 8 years old and afraid of the dark. His mother's voice echoed from downstairs, calling him for dinner. But her face kept changing, sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes not his mother at all but Helen, or Emma, or passengers from Flight 281 whose names he'd memorized during those endless years of watching. Frank? Emma's voice cut through the chaos, pulling him back to the present. She was standing in the doorway, her face etched with concern. You missed our appointment with the federal investigators. They've been waiting for 2 hours. Frank turned to face her, and for a split second, she looked exactly like her 7-year-old self, gap-toothed and innocent. I can't do this anymore, Emma. The memories, they're all mixing together. I don't know which ones are real. She'd been staying in the hotel room next to his, appointed as his unofficial liaison with the outside world. The investigators wanted answers Frank couldn't give, the media wanted stories he couldn't tell, and the passengers wanted reassurance he couldn't provide. Only Emma understood the weight he carried. "You're not alone in this," she said softly, stepping into the bathroom. "Some of the passengers are experiencing strange things too." Frank's head snapped up. "What kind of things?" "Memories that don't belong to them. Margaret Chin, she was 23 when the plane disappeared. She called me this morning crying. She said she remembered her daughter's wedding, but she doesn't have a daughter. She remembered holding grandchildren she's never met, attending her mother's funeral even though her mother is still alive." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. The passengers were starting to remember fragments of the years they'd lost, experiencing echoes of the lives they should have lived. Just as Vincent Thorne had promised they never would. "It's getting worse," Frank said, his voice barely audible. "The deal is breaking down. They're not supposed to remember anything." Emma pulled out her phone and showed him a video. "This was taken yesterday at the hotel where the passengers are staying." The grainy footage showed Thomas Wright, a businessman who'd been 41 in 1981, standing in the lobby and arguing with empty air. But as Frank watched, he could see something else, a faint shimmer in the space where Thomas was gesturing, as if something invisible was standing there. "He kept saying, 'I know what you want, but I won't let you take them,'" Emma explained. "The hotel staff thought he was having a breakdown, but look at this." She swiped to another video. This was taken at the same time from a different angle. In the second video, Frank could see something that made his blood freeze. For just a moment, a figure in a white suit was visible beside Thomas, Vincent Thorne, his smile as cold and predatory as it had been in that bar 44 years ago. "He's collecting them," Frank whispered. "The passengers are remembering because he's trying to reclaim what he gave up. The deal was supposed to end with their return, but something went wrong. He's not done with us." Emma set down her phone and reached into her purse, pulling out a leather-bound journal. "I found this in your room yesterday when the cleaning service was there. It fell out of your jacket." Frank's hands shook as he took the journal. He'd forgotten about it, forgotten about the years of guilt and desperate attempts to make amends. The cover was worn smooth by his touch, the pages yellowed with age and stained with tears. "I wrote to them," he said, his voice breaking. "Every passenger, every crew member. Letters to their families, apologies for what I'd done. I wrote one every day for 44 years. Emma opened the journal to a random page, revealing Frank's careful handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Patterson, today would have been your daughter Sarah's 45th birthday. I watched her blow out candles on a cake she'll never taste, surrounded by friends she'll never meet. I'm sorry I stole her future from her. I'm sorry I stole your future together. When this is over, I'll find a way to give it back. I promise. Frank." "There are thousands of them," Emma said softly. "Letters to people who aged while their loved ones slept. Apologies to children who grew up without parents, to spouses who grieved for decades." Frank turned the pages, seeing his own handwriting change over the years, sometimes steady, sometimes shaky with emotion, sometimes barely legible through his tears. Every passenger, every family member, every person affected by his choice to make that deal. "I planned to stay behind," he said, his voice hollow. "When Vincent came to collect, I was going to go willingly. Let the passengers live their lives while I paid the price. But he released me too, and now I don't understand why." Emma closed the journal and looked at him with eyes that held both compassion and determination. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the real test isn't whether you can sacrifice yourself, it's whether you can live with what you've done and find a way to make it right." Another time slip hit Frank, and suddenly he was back in the cockpit of Flight 281, watching his passengers sleep peacefully while years passed like minutes outside the windows. But this time, he wasn't alone. Vincent Thorne stood beside him, his smile wider than ever. "You're beginning to understand," Vincent's voice echoed in his memory. "The debt was never about time, Frank. It was about choice. And you still have one more choice to make." Frank snapped back to the present, his heart racing. Emma was staring at him with alarm, but he could barely see her through the fog of temporal displacement. "He's coming back," Frank said, his voice filled with terrible certainty. "Vincent Thorne is coming back, and this time, he's not just after me. He wants them all, every passenger, every year they should have lived. The deal isn't over, Emma. It's just beginning." Outside their hotel window, the afternoon sun suddenly dimmed, as if something vast and hungry had passed between it and the earth. In the distance, Frank could hear the sound of aircraft engines, but when he looked, the sky was empty. The final choice was approaching, and Frank Mallory was running out of time. The hotel conference room had been hastily arranged, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the faces of the 137 passengers and crew of Flight 281. They sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, their expressions ranging from confusion to fear to desperate hope. 3 days of medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and endless questions had left them all exhausted and fragile. Frank stood at the front of the room, his hands steady for the first time in days. The time slips had stopped that morning, replaced by a crystalline clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. He knew why. Vincent Thorne was coming, and the supernatural chaos was settling into its final pattern. "I know you have questions," Frank began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I know you're scared, confused, angry. You have every right to be. What happened to us, what I allowed to happen to us, it was my fault." Margaret Chin raised her hand tentatively. "Captain, the doctors say we haven't aged, but I keep remembering things. A daughter I never had, grandchildren who called me Nana. Are we going crazy?" Frank looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the 23-year-old woman who'd boarded his plane in 1981, but the shadow of the life she should have lived. The wedding dress she never wore, the children she never raised, the career she never built. "You're not crazy, Margaret. You're remembering the lives you should have had, the 44 years that were stolen from you. And that's my fault too." Thomas Wright stood up from the back of the room, his face flushed with anger. "Then tell us the truth. Stop dancing around it, and tell us what really happened." Frank took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades settling on his shoulders. "In 1981, I was in debt to dangerous people. I'd gambled away everything, my house, my wife's jewelry, our future. The night before our flight, I met a man who offered me a deal. He said he could give me time to fix my mistakes, to protect you all from the consequences of my choices." "What kind of deal?" asked Sarah Patterson, the young teacher who'd been traveling to Miami for her honeymoon. "I sold our time," Frank said simply. "All of it. 44 years of your lives in exchange for keeping you safe from the men who were coming for me. You would sleep peacefully while I experienced every moment, every year, every loss. You'd wake up thinking only hours had passed." The room erupted in voices, anger, disbelief, accusations. Frank let the storm wash over him, accepting every word of condemnation as his due. But gradually, the voices died down, replaced by a more frightening silence. "Why are we remembering now?" Margaret asked quietly. Frank's expression darkened. "Because the deal is being renegotiated. The man I made the bargain with, Vincent Thorne, he's not human. He's something that feeds on time, on lost possibilities. He honored our agreement for 44 years, but now he wants more. He wants to collect the lives you should have lived, the experiences you're starting to remember." Emma stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the door. "That's why some of you have been seeing things, hearing voices. He's been visiting you, trying to convince you to come with him willingly." Thomas nodded grimly. "The man in the white suit. He came to my room last night. Said he could give me back everything I'd lost, my career, my family, the life I should have had. All I had to do was sign another contract." "You can't trust him," Frank said urgently. "Whatever he promises, the price will be higher than you can imagine. I know because I've been paying it for 44 years. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out the leather journal Emma had found. "I wrote to all of your families. Every day for 44 years, I watched your lives unfold, The children who grew up without you, the spouses who grieved and moved on, the parents who died never knowing what happened to you. I wrote letters I could never send, apologies for the future I stole from all of you. He set the journal on the table in front of him. I can't give you back those 44 years. I can't undo the pain your families went through, or the lives that moved on without you. But I can make sure Vincent Thorne doesn't take anything else from you. How? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank smiled, and for the first time in decades, it was genuine. The deal was never about time. It was about choice. Vincent fed on my guilt, my desperation, my willingness to sacrifice anything to escape the consequences of my actions. But there's one thing he never counted on. What's that? Margaret asked. That I'd learn to forgive myself. Frank's voice grew stronger. For 44 years, I carried the weight of every moment you lost, every experience you missed. I punished myself with memories of futures that could never be. But the real prison wasn't the time we lost. It was my refusal to believe I deserved redemption. The temperature in the room began to drop, and several passengers shivered as their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Outside, the afternoon sky was darkening, though no clouds were visible. He's coming, Frank said calmly. Vincent Thorne is coming to collect what he thinks he's owed. But here's what he doesn't understand. The debt was paid in full the moment you forgave me for what I'd done. We haven't forgiven you, Thomas said bluntly. Frank nodded. I know. And that's exactly why this will work. The lights in the room flickered, and suddenly Vincent Thorne stood at the back of the conference room, his white suit immaculate, his smile as cold as winter. Frank, he said pleasantly, his voice carrying impossible clearly through the space. It's time to renegotiate our terms. Frank turned to face his passengers one last time. I'm going to walk out of here with him. When I do, you'll be free, truly free. No more memories of lost years, no more visits from creatures in white suits. You'll be able to build the lives you should have had. Captain, no, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. There has to be another way. There is, Frank said softly. But it requires me to make the choice I should have made 44 years ago. Not to run from my mistakes, but to face them. He walked toward Vincent Thorne, his step steady and sure. As he passed Emma, he pressed something into her hand, a small piece of paper folded many times. Tell them I'm sorry, he whispered. But tell them I'm not afraid anymore. Vincent's smile widened as Frank approached. Shall we go, old friend? Frank looked back at his passengers one last time, memorizing their faces. Time lent me this one mercy, he said quietly. Let me repay it. Then Frank Mallory walked out of the conference room with the devil he'd bargained with, and the lights came back on. Outside, Emma unfolded the paper Frank had given her. In his careful handwriting, it read simply, The plane. Sunset. Don't follow me. Through the window, she watched as two figures walked across the tarmac toward the ghost of Flight 281, now little more than rusted metal and faded paint. But as they approached, the aircraft began to shimmer, becoming solid and new again, ready for one final journey. Frank Mallory was going home at last. 6 months had passed since Flight 281 made its impossible landing, and the world had slowly begun to accept what couldn't be explained. The passengers had scattered to the four winds, each carrying the strange gift of a second chance at life. Some had reunited with families who had aged beyond recognition, others had quietly started over in a world that had moved on without them. Emma Rodriguez stood at the edge of Willowbrook Cemetery, a small bouquet of white roses in her hands. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made promises feel possible. She walked slowly between the weathered headstones until she found the one she was looking for. Frank Mallory. 1940 to 1981. Beloved husband and pilot. He brought them home. The headstone was simple, carved from gray granite that had weathered 44 years of seasons. Helen Mallory had commissioned it in 1982, when the Coast Guard had finally called off the search. She'd been buried beside it 3 years ago, her grave marked with fresh flowers that Emma suspected came from Margaret Chin, who visited regularly. Emma knelt and placed her roses beside the headstone, then pulled out a letter from her jacket pocket. It was worn from being read countless times, the paper soft as fabric between her fingers. "Dear Emma," it began in Frank's careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, then everything went according to plan. I know you probably have questions, maybe even anger about my choice. That's okay. I spent 44 years being angry at myself." The letter had been waiting for her at the hotel desk the morning after Frank walked away with Vincent Thorne. No one had seen him leave it there, just as no one had seen the old Boeing 727 take off from the runway at sunset, even though 3 different control towers had logged its departure. The passengers are free now. Really free. The memories of their lost years will fade like dreams, and they'll be able to build the lives they were meant to have. Margaret will meet someone wonderful and have the daughter she remembered. Thomas will start the business he always talked about. Sarah will finally take that honeymoon. Emma smiled through her tears, thinking of the phone calls she'd received over the past months. Margaret had indeed met someone, a widowed professor at the local college who made her laugh. Thomas had opened a small bookstore in Vermont, sending Emma a photo of himself behind the counter looking genuinely happy for the first time since she'd known him. Sarah and her husband had renewed their vows in Hawaii, the honeymoon they'd missed finally taken at the age of 67 and looking 23. As for your father, Emma, James is at peace. I saw him one last time before we landed, saw him smile and tell me he understood why I made the choice I did. He said to tell you that he's proud of the woman you became, and that love doesn't end just because time gets complicated. That part always made Emma cry. She'd spent her entire adult life wondering if her father would approve of her choices, her career as a grief counselor, her decision never to marry, her quiet life dedicated to helping others navigate loss. Reading Frank's words felt like receiving her father's blessing across the decades. I need you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. For 44 years I lived in the shadow of my mistakes, trapped by guilt and regret. But Vincent Thorne taught me something important. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about accepting it and choosing to do better. The debt is paid, Emma. All of it. The passengers are free, your father is at peace, and I finally understand what Helen tried to tell me all those years ago, that forgiveness, especially forgiving yourself, is the most powerful force in any universe. A gentle breeze stirred the trees overhead, and Emma looked up to see a plane crossing the sky, just an ordinary commercial flight following its scheduled route. She watched until it disappeared into the clouds, then looked back at the letter. Take care of them for me, Emma. Not because they need protection, but because they deserve to know that someone remembers their story. Help them understand that surviving something impossible doesn't make you broken, it makes you blessed. And take care of yourself too. You've spent so much time helping others heal from loss that you forgot to heal from your own. Your father loved you, Emma. I love you too, like the daughter I never had. You gave me the gift of forgiveness when I couldn't give it to myself. Look for me in the sunrise, in the sound of aircraft engines, in the moment when lost things finally find their way home. I'm not gone, Emma. I'm just flying a different route. Thank you for believing in redemption. With love and gratitude. Frank. Emma folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her pocket. Around her, the cemetery was peaceful, filled with the quiet presence of stories that had found their endings. She thought about the passengers of Flight 281, scattered across the country but connected by their shared experience of impossible grace. Margaret had started a support group for the families of missing persons, using her own story to bring hope to others. Thomas had written a book about second chances that had become a bestseller. Sarah had become a volunteer pilot, flying medical supplies to remote areas, saying she owed the sky a debt of gratitude. They were living, really living, in ways they might never have managed if they'd had ordinary lives. The 44 years they'd lost had been transformed into wisdom, compassion, and an appreciation for time that only those who'd been outside it could truly understand. Emma stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something that made her heart skip, a small white flower growing beside Frank's headstone, where none had been before. It was out of season, impossible in the December cold, but there it was, perfect and pure against the gray stone. Above her, the sound of aircraft engines hummed across the sky, and Emma smiled. Somewhere in that vast blue expanse, Frank Mallory was still flying, still watching over his passengers, still keeping his promise to bring them safely home. Time, she realized, wasn't about the years you had. It was about what you did with the moments you were given, and how you chose to love despite the cost. Some debts, finally, had been paid in full,